Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. I continue on reading with Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. That evening for supper, the family was joined by other landowners, Paul Ashington, Aubrey Milton, and Harold Montgomery. Naturally, conversation quickly turned to the state of the country. They say the Queen was always a lively companion, which might have been good for the ever-serious King Charles. How she loved dancing and fashions, and now she has war to occupy her mind, Paul said. And she has even meddled into that, Harold replied. She is the Queen, Carinza, who was usually quiet, pointed out. Ah, true enough, he replied. She's content to be indulged by the King, despite the fact that Englishmen are now killing Englishmen, Catherine said, which some say is mostly due to her holdover. His Majesty, they apparently have a harmonious relationship now, although it was far from that in the beginning. I am not sure it is good for King Charles to placate her, though while essentially ignoring the will of his subjects. Julian looked at her with surprise, realizing she had apparently made a point to learn about and discuss matters of politics with her husband. Although he still believed Robert had acted outlandishly, he could not help feeling genuine interest in Catherine. Hush, love, Robert said. That may be construed as treason. Only if it reaches the ears of the court, Catherine replied mischievously, touching her husband's hand. That is unlikely to happen from this remote corner of Cornwall, said Aubrey. We do not even hear news of the war until it is months old. It is frustrating. We must believe that Sir Richard Grenville can defeat the Roundheads who have now attacked Cornwall, Paul said. Parliament thinks to cut off our tin supply to stop us from financing the King's army. You have heard, of course, that Restormel Castle was overtaken by the parliamentarians in August. That battle is still underway. Yes, it was queer to come home from our honeymoon to find that while we were riding gondolas in Venice, one of Cornwall's castles was being ravaged. Perhaps we were irresponsible to go, Catherine said. Robert immediately thought of his determination to give Catherine a honeymoon regardless of what national catastrophe was occurring. She, who had never had anything, was not going to be allowed to forfeit a trip she may never get the chance to take again, depending on how the war progressed. He saw it as one last chance to create the memories of a lifetime for her. Nay, love, we could have done nothing. We have funded the Cavaliers right along, Robert said, referring to the Royalist army. What good would it have done to sit here and wonder week after week? The news has just now reached us as it is, so our presence here would have accomplished nothing. Maybe with Greenville we have a chance, said Catherine. No, His Majesty must do some soul-searching if he wants to salvage his kingdom, which is all of the country, not just Cornwall. Julian said, I have spoken treason now too, brother. I am surprised you haven't before now, Robert replied, smiling. Nay, hope of a tidy end is over. But surely the king cannot be defeated, Aubrey cried. I don't see how he can win, Richard replied. You are outrageous, all of you, Jennifer said, and you should mind your tongues before you find yourselves deprived of them at command of the guard. Why can't these differences be solved without war? There will always be war, Catherine said with resignation. Paul said he did not think it was possible for the king to be unaware of his growing unpopularity among those who were previously loyal, and that the Queen was doing little or nothing to help. The people are suspicious of her, he said, and it is primarily because she is doing everything in her power to bring Catholicism to England. She won't succeed. People here will never stand for it, ever since Bloody Mary's reign. Paul had met King Charles once, and Catherine asked about him. He is small in stature, although he certainly possesses a great charm at times. Overall, he is too aloof with his subjects, though. They never understood each other, which is a bad case. He has a firm and proud belief that God set him on the throne and commands at will, thinking his decisions should never be questioned. It is what caused this war, really. The group looked a bit uncomfortable, as the dialogue could be considered treason, but Paul seemed as if he did not care. Indeed, carelessness was the attitude of many Cornishmen at that time. Although Cornwall was mainly for the king, the men were still frustrated by his lack of perception concerning his subjects. Much strife was created with the Queen's insistence on taking the country back to Rome, and the harsh way the king dealt with the Puritans who had now become his undoing. How is our father doing?" Robert asked, changing the subject. "He has been rather fractious since this morning," Jennifer answered. "Catherine should visit him after dinner." "I already planned to do so," said Catherine, smiling. "Yes," thought Julian, "she says and does all the right things, but no one with her background could be this polished in manners and speech unless playing a role. I refuse to believe it," he complained to himself. "It would make her too good to be true, and life is not a child's storybook." Only Robert realized his brother's cynical expression and laughed to himself. "No matter," he thought. "You'll find out soon enough that she's everything she appears to be." He was unaware that he was smiling slightly, but Catherine noticed and wondered why. As promised, Catherine went to her father-in-law's room immediately after supper. "Lord Justin, may I ask why you accepted me so heartily, and with not even a warning in advance about our marriage? It seems odd, and I wonder if perhaps you are merely trying on a pleasant attitude." "I have done that myself on many occasions to avoid conflict." "Stop calling me Lord Justin, and nay, child, it is no agreeable facade. I'm pleased Robert found someone with whom he is so happy. May I tell you a family story?" "You may tell me anything you wish." "My grandfather, another Robert Bradshaw, you've seen his picture in the hall?" Catherine nodded, and he went on. "He was, of course, the owner of Briarwood, and the second son of his father, the first having died from a childhood malady. It was always preached to him that he must marry, in keeping with his station as the lord of a large estate has a significant responsibility. Of course, I don't presume to scoff at the philosophy, as one cannot simply wed anyone and hope for an appropriate outcome. There are such as would marry for wealth, just as there are some who are unsuitable to marry those with considerable responsibilities. Anyway, I diverge. Robert fell in love with a beautiful Spanish woman who had come to the manor to repair its many tapestries. He wanted above all else to marry her, and she was equally in love. But the family stood out against it." Catherine finished. "Yes, alas, they did, and he eventually married someone chosen for him by my great-grandfather. But it was not a happy union. I saw how he struggled to be kind to his wife and include her in conversations and compliment her. But it was strained and forced, and in some ways obviously false. She eventually developed such a lost and lonely look in her eye that could only have come from knowing or suspecting he was never in love with her. Perhaps not many people in my family noticed that the marriage had its effect on my grandfather as well. He wore a similar haunted look, and the only time I ever saw him completely happy was when he spoke of Floriana. That was her name. He told me about her once when I was old enough to understand, and when he showed me her miniature, his eyes lit up in his old age, just as they must have when he was a young man and gave her up. He always told me it was the worst mistake he ever made. Maybe I am grown old and maudlin, but I would never want either of my sons to go through life with that sad and lamenting expression I saw my grandfather wear. For my father, from whom I get my name, things were very different. He was introduced to his wife, Agatha, when he was determined never to marry, and they suddenly found themselves deeply in love. She was the woman who was chosen for him, so God in his heaven must have been smiling on him at that time." "And you?" Catherine asked. "Ah, yes, I knew you would ask. I had a wonderful marriage with Nicolette, although she was quite skeptical of me at first. She is far more like Julian than Robert, and had a cynical view of the world. Because she was an heiress to a great fortune, she immediately thought I was looking to expand the family's coffers. However, it was her I loved from the moment I saw her. No need to wonder about her looks, young Catherine, as you have already seen them. Dark hair, startling greenish blue eyes. That reminds you of two individuals, does it not?" Catherine laughed and said that it did. She was even skeptical about finding England pleasant, but she began to love it here. I had her only a short time, however, 11 years, and she was lost to me with the birth of the twins. It was an infection they could not seem to cure, and at first I railed against the babies as if they had somehow taken their mother from me on purpose. Naturally, gossiping servants told this tale to the boys when they were young, and for a while they believed I resented them. That is all over with now, though. I love them more than life, that I do. But I would give anything to have my Nicolette back with me. Of course you would. I cannot imagine what it would be like to lose one's husband or wife, especially when the couple is truly in love. Sometimes I feel I was unfair to Robert to marry him, as I have a condition with my heart that may shorten my life if I do not take care. It was from a fever when I was young. I believe Daniel Sennert of Wittenberg described it in a book once as scarlatina, but I no longer have it, and as my father confiscated most of anything in the cottage we could read, I only hope that Robert is not left a young widower, but he seemed determined to marry me regardless. Lord Bradshaw noticed that Catherine easily quoted from a book that any of her peers, gentry, or villagers would likely never be able to comprehend, and he felt immensely proud of his son's wife. You did right to marry him, my lovely girl, affliction or not. I've never seen him happier. Are the family treating you well? I think perhaps they don't say what is most on their mind, Catherine said with a smile, and they may still be a bit cautious about my motives and somewhat piqued at Robert for the way he introduced me to the household, but the only one I believe will never accept me is Julian. At this, the old man laughed heartily, just as Robert always did when she brought up Julian's animosity, although neither ever explained why they found it so amusing. Julian is somewhat of an enigma to people. You remember how I said Robert is very much like myself? Well, Julian is all his mother. He got nothing from me. He must do things his own way or not at all. He likes to order everyone about, and Robert has a very passive way of ignoring him and doing what he pleases regardless of Julian's opinion, which may make him just a bit wiser regarding the handling of people. It is not that Robert has no spirit, as you well know. Depending on the circumstances, he has a great deal of spirit indeed. He just refuses to waste it on things that eventually straighten themselves out on their own. So do not worry. Julian may rent for a short time, but then he gives in, and the two are the same person once again, as twins often are. To me they seem as if they are not alike at all. I see no similarities beyond their looks. There are differences, certainly, but there are many similarities as well. I think their minds are often on their way to the same destination, but have separate ways of getting there. Later, as Catherine went through the hall toward the staircase, she stopped to view the family portraits. She was particularly interested in Lord Justin's grandfather and his wife, as she could not stop thinking about the story, the romantic love between Robert and Floriana, which Robert had not consummated for fear of his family's disapproval. How had he broken it to her? Did he face her and boldly tell her that he could not marry without the approval of his family, or did he simply allow the relationship to lapse? Perhaps he wrote her a letter. Catherine stopped at the portrait of his wife, whom she knew was called Barbary. She did indeed look a bit sad. Or am I imagining that because I now know how it all came out? At length, Catherine decided that she was not just being fanciful, as both Robert and his wife looked a bit lost, not truly happy as Lord Justin looked in his portrait, and his father before him. She didn't need to wonder how hers and Robert's portraits would come out. She knew the happiness they felt would show in their faces, and she finally made her way down to the drawing room where Jennifer and Carinza were having Malmsey wine. "How fares our father?" "He seems so cheered by my visits, Jennifer. It makes me feel good," Catherine said. "He seems to have taken to you at once. It is almost as if you've known each other before," Carinza said. "Actually, it does feel like that in a way. He is so easy to talk to and understands everything I say, and I am not always easy to understand," she added with a smile, and Jennifer thought that one simply couldn't help liking Catherine. "Where has Robert gone?" Catherine asked. "He is in the study with Julian. They are discussing estate matters as well as the price of that black stallion he's finally buying tomorrow. Of course he may have told you already that his beloved horse Prince is ailing," and Catherine nodded. Carinza swirled her glass, looking as if she were suddenly deep in thought, and then said, "I remember the first time I saw them coming, charging up on their horses. What a sight they were! Julian on his beautiful grey, Rudy, and Robert on Prince. Sometimes the only way I could tell them apart was by their horses." Catherine thought that Carinza looked much softer in that moment than was her usual effect, and suddenly wondered if she were in love with one of the twins. She hoped, if that were true, that it was Julian she cared for, as she did not want to be the cause of another woman's broken heart. Yes, they always love to ride, Jennifer said, and then quickly changed the subject to the far more banal topic of the church's upcoming bazaar. Catherine was sure then. Jennifer's way of changing the subject confirmed it. Carinza was in love with one of them. Perhaps Julian would someday find that he cared for Carinza, and Catherine thought again how beautiful the young woman would look as if she would only come out of herself and be a bit livelier. She observed her somber brown dress, which was not much different from the drab grey gown she had on at the first meeting. It is almost as if she is trying to look the part of a poor relation, although she could surely dress differently if she wanted. Finally, she resigned herself that there was nothing much she could do unless Carinza wanted to change. When Robert emerged from the study, Catherine told him about her visit to his father. "He adores you, Catherine. I can't help remembering how concerned you were that he'd reject you, and he became your biggest champion. If only Julian would follow suit. Oh, don't worry about him. But doesn't he quarrel with you about it still?" "Our marriage?" "Yes. Is he still angry?" "Oh, that was all a storm in the teacup, as it always is with Julian. He knows it's an accomplished fact, and he's finished ranting about it." Catherine realized then that the twins' bond was much stronger than she thought. As angry as Julian was, they were now just as they had always been together, and the marriage was just a fact of life. Catherine smiled in spite of herself, remembering how Jennifer had once told her that Julian and Robert could no more do without each other than the sun and the moon. Ultimately, even though she knew Julian did not care for her presence in the household, she could not truly resent anyone who cared so much for Robert, and her sister-in-law's words had a distincting ring of truth.